Saudi Arabia's allies stage a sit-in on Parliament Hill. That's tonight on The Source. Today, about 200 environmental extremists from across Canada and foreign countries traveled to Ottawa to protest against oil. The CBC said there were 300 people there, but they were counting their own contingent of CBC reporters, producers, assistant producers, directors, sound men, lighting experts, location scouts, key grips, gaffers, caterers, both in English and in French, and from TV and radio. I'll get back to the CBC in a moment, but let's talk about the 200 protesters there today who don't work for the CBC. Here's a picture of that massive crowd. A sleeping giant awakes. Canadians are outraged. Oh boy, that's got to be disappointing for the professional protesters who would build this as the greatest political moment in Canadian history. But just stop for a moment to think about what they did. They flew on jet planes and drove in cars to show just how much they don't like oil. They flew and they drove. Logic much? Greenpeace, the $350 million a year multinational corporation headquartered in Amsterdam, was one of the organizers. So was a foreign group called UK Tar Sands Network. Foreigners. And those foreigners paid lobbyists here in Canada, telling us Canadians what to do, and boasting about their plans to break the law, and even to bully our democratically elected parliament into doing what those foreigners want us to do. Here's a picture of Greenpeace criminals on the roof of Parliament Hill in 2009. Hey, I got an idea. Try doing that in Saudi Arabia or Iran or the United Arab Emirates. Hell, try doing that in the United States post 9/11. I mean, foreign lobbyists breaking our laws because our democratically elected government isn't doing what those foreign lobbyists want us to do. Here's another picture of Greenpeace criminals trespassing on a refinery in the oil sands. Again, try doing that in an OPEC country. Sort of proves my point. These foreign meddlers pick on Canada precisely because we're the most liberal, most democratic, most gentle country in the world, and it would be too tough to try to protest in Iran or Saudi Arabia. Now, the Saudi embassy in Ottawa is just a few blocks away from Parliament Hill. It's actually right on Sussex Drive. Saudi Arabia is the biggest oil producer in the world. They have the biggest oil reserves in the world. If this protest today really was about oil, why didn't they just go there a few blocks away? I mean, we here in Canada clean up when we have an oil spill. Saudi Arabia covers up theirs. We engage with our critics. Saudi Arabia kills theirs. We allow labor unions. Saudi Arabia does not. We have peacekeepers. Saudi Arabia continues to finance terrorism. We treat minorities and women with great respect. Saudi Arabia abuses them through Sharia law. But don't tell that to the C-list celebrities like Dave Thomas, who have endorsed this blame Canada approach to oil protesting. No, I'm not talking about the famous Dave Thomas, the late president of the Wendy's restaurant chain, a great man. I'm talking about the lame Dave Thomas, the least funny cast member of CTV, who really hasn't been heard from since his SCTV days, for whom this great protest was a way to get a little PR, though I guess he couldn't really be bothered to attend himself. Seriously, that's the best they could do on Parliament Hill today, is get Dave Thomas to send out an email. Until a month ago, all of this was just normal, though. I mean, a bunch of self-righteous activists denouncing us for driving cars and then getting in their own cars to drive away. But then something amazing happened just a month ago. We found out, by accident really, that the Saudi dictatorship was quietly orchestrating anti-oil sands skullduggery here in Canada. It was all secret. The Saudis were hiring a major law firm to threaten Canadian broadcasters not to run ads that promoted the oil sands and criticized Saudi conflict oil. The only way we heard about this was when someone who was threatened became a whistleblower and blew the lid off the Saudis' anti-Canada campaign. I mean, really, how different is it from the known fact that extremists from Europe or the United States come in here to lobby against the oil sands? I guess it's a bit different because Saudi Arabia is a brutal dictatorship and it's our chief competitor for oil exports to the United States. Sort of puts this whole Parliament Hill protest in a new light, doesn't it? And maybe it helps explain why the protesters haven't protested outside the Saudi embassy. But here's a real head scratcher. Last week, the bosses of a big labor union came out against the oil sands and against the proposed Keystone XL pipeline that would ship oil from the oil sands down to the United States. Here's a clip from their press conference on Parliament Hill last week.
Mauvais projet. Pourquoi c'est un mauvais projet? D'abord, c'est un mauvais projet pour les emplois. Ce qu'on fait en envoyant 900 000 barils par jour.
Yes, you're listening to French. A union boss claiming to represent the oil sands, first language English, second language English of the Newfoundland variety, doesn't speak a word of English himself. He is talking in French. Good God, he's still going. Shut the front door. I mean, do you really think he speaks for the tens of thousands of hard-working welders and pipe fitters and construction workers and engineers up there? As if. That's just Bolshevism. I mean, look, they did find one English-speaking union boss to talk. He not only condemned the oil sands pipeline, without which, of course, existing oil sands workers wouldn't really have a job. You got to get the oil to the market. But this union boss also called out Ethical Oil's TV ads. He called them, get this, he called them racist. Look at this.
I think it has racist overtones. I don't like it. I think it's a cheap, inappropriate approach.
You've seen those ads. I've played them on this channel a million times. They're not racist at all. They're the opposite of racist. They're calling for equality for Saudi women. In fact, to ignore the plight of Saudi women, well, that's racist. Now, our friend Ali Khan Velshi went on TV with that stupid union boss. And as you might notice, Ali Khan is a young, visible minority. And the anti-oil sands union bigot is a middle-aged white guy. So when Ali Khan challenged the union boss to stand by his claim of racism, well, he couldn't. Look at this.
You know, last week you were making your arguments, and you referred to this as ethical oil ad, which Craig just showed, and you said it had racist overtones. So my question is this: first of all, I think it's absurd on its face to say that an ad that I designed has racist overtones with respect to you know, other visible minorities. So I want to know, first of all, are you willing to repeat that that argument now that you're seated a foot away from me, and are you willing to justify it and say what is racist about criticizing the treatment of women in Saudi Arabia?
That's not what I said.
You used the word racist overtones. That's exactly what you said.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said.
That's not what I said. That's exactly what I said. Oh, you brown people are so confusing. You get in the way of my rant about you being racist. What an idiot that union boss is. Look, I wonder if the Saudi embassy made similar threats to that union boss that he did to TV stations. I mean, the Saudis specialize in threats against labor unions. Did you know that labor unions are illegal in Saudi Arabia? All those foreign migrant workers are not allowed to unionize, of course. You'd think a union boss in Canada would stand up for good, well-paying Canadian union jobs in the oil sands and be against near-slave labor jobs in Saudi Arabia. Yeah, not that guy. You'd be wrong if you thought so. Listen, I think the whole oil sands debate is fascinating. I love it. I wrote a book about it, and I accept that there really is a debate. There are two sides to the issue. But the Saudis don't think so. They don't actually believe in a debate, hence their fatwa to shut down Ethical Oil's TV ads, a legal threat that CTV actually obeyed and is still obeying. Remember this clip from CTV's Jacqueline Milsharek last week, a line that really could have been written in Riyadh. Look at this.
Are we really more ethical than countries like Saudi Arabia? And I put this to you.
There was a little laugh in there. Are we really more ethical? Milsharek was so embarrassed by the feedback that she got. She actually tried to explain herself over the weekend, and she wrote this on Twitter. Look at her tweet there. In case of confusion, my question was, are we any better than when for decades we supported Arab dictators? Well, speak for yourself. I never did, and I don't think Canada did. And you know, your question speaks for itself, Jacqueline. It's really not working. Stop being a Saudi diplomat and start being a journalist again. Now look at this. Look at this. This is a story in the New York Times today about Saudi Arabia's secret involvement in the Canadian anti-oil sands movement. It's huge news. I mean, the New York Times, easily one of the 5 most influential left-wing newspapers in the United States. Now, Canadian newspapers have covered the story too, and even CTV has, even though it's getting a little weird sometimes. But guess who hasn't had a single word to say about a foreign dictatorship called Saudi Arabia threatening Canadian TV stations not to air the Ethical Oil TV ad? Any guesses? Any guesses, Bueller? Bueller? You're right. The CBC. Now, as of noon today, when I last checked, the CBC had not aired a single minute about the scandal of a foreign government threatening Canadian TV stations into submission. Of course they haven't. They hate the oil sands over the CBC. They love them, the Saudis. I'm not making that up. On 9/11, the week of 9/11, the CBC actually ran a 9/11 conspiracy theory movie in commemoration. Classy. I mean, we know whose side the CBC takes in the war on terror. They have a corporate policy never to refer to the 9/11 terrorists as terrorists. They actually say that would be taking sides. But they love calling anti-Saudi critics terrorists. Look at this clip.
There are extremists in every religion, whether it's Islam, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Hinduism, even Buddhists. The Jewish Defense League is a banned terrorist organization in Canada.
Saudi Arabia is great. The Jews are terrorists. The CBC later issued a groveling apology for calling the Jews a bunch of terrorists, but it was a pretty good summary of the CBC's views on Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. And on the oil sands side, the CBC has run several anti-oil sands propaganda films over the years, hosted by anti-oil sands extremist David Suzuki. So of course the CBC hasn't reported on the Saudis or even the condemnation of the Saudis by Canadian cabinet ministers. This is an international diplomatic incident. But like I said earlier, the CBC camped out all day. They literally did a live internet broadcast of the entire droning anti-oil sands protest on Parliament Hill today. They couldn't get enough of it. The whole thing, courtesy of your tax dollars. The CBC was actually the key part to that protest. Almost nobody showed up, but the CBC was there. Pom-poms are ready to cheer. But the CBC is still silent on the Saudi bullies. But you know, they are. But we here at The Sun weren't. We talked about it all week, and we asked leading government officials about it, and we actually got some answers. Ron Ambrose spoke out, so did John Baird, so did Joe Oliver, and Jason Kenney. Kenney just let her rip. Listen to this.
Canada is a country that is a champion of freedom of speech. That is a constitutional right, and we don't take kindly to foreign governments threatening directly or indirectly Canadian broadcasters or media for giving voice to freedom of speech. We think that's inappropriate and certainly inconsistent with Canada's belief in freedom of speech.
We don't take kindly. It's inappropriate. They're making threats. That is tough talk. And the non-government media in this country, that is the media not owned by the Canadian government like the CBC, and the media not controlled by the Saudi government's lawyers like CTV, the non-government media have been great. The Saudis have been scared of the oil sands for years. We know that. They've been scared of the ethical oil TV ads for a month. That's when their threats first went out. They were terrified of the non-government media reaction in this country. And now that the U.S. is picking it up in the New York Times, they're panicking, with media of all political stripes focusing on their abuse of women back home, because that's what the ethical oil ads were about. And then they were shocked that cabinet minister after cabinet minister denounced Saudi Arabia, not just their meddling in Canada, but their treatment of women back home. That's what Ron Ambrose said. So over the weekend, the Saudi dictator made a tiny microscopic gesture. The dictator there said that in 4 years' time, oh, I promise, in 4 years' time, he'd allow women in Saudi Arabia to vote in elections for powerless local councils for the first time ever. So women will still be forced to wear burqas. They still can't drive. They still can't go outside without a male guardian. The elections will still be meaningless if the dictator even keeps his promise. No opposition parties are allowed. No free press is allowed. But women will be permitted to vote in 4 years' time. Although how they'll vote without a driver's license or removing their veil to show their identity, well, the dictator didn't really answer that part. But look, at least it was the tiniest crack in the Saudi armor. It's the first time I can remember that. But remember this, the pressure for this microscopic change didn't come from Amnesty International or from Canadian feminists standing in solidarity with their sisters. They're silent on Saudi Arabia. They're too busy condemning Israel or celebrating Sharia law in Canadian high schools in Toronto. The pressure did not come from the CBC, which has been silent. The pressure came from the Sun News Network. We pressed Canadian cabinet ministers into doing something that we have actually never seen before, publicly calling Saudi evil by its real name. And the Saudis blinked. This whole idea, this whole ethical oil idea, the book I wrote, the website, it started as a way to rebut anti-oil sands lies by Greenpeace fundraisers and other hacks. I never knew that it would be the first domino to fall that would then make others fall and others. that might result in the bigoted, woman-hating dictator of Saudi Arabia grudgingly offer his country's beaten women the tiniest promise of reform. That's what I like to talk about. But if you prefer to hear from foreign lobbyists, hey, feel free to tune into the CBC. I hear they're about to run a 10-part miniseries on these 200 foreign protesters who are on Parliament Hill dumping on our country today.